So I had the pleasure of getting ready to moderate this panel, which will pretty much drive itself because we've got some great folks. I'm going to do a brief intro. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I could take the entire time just giving background on all these folks, so I'm not going to do that. They are very Googleable, so you all can kind of check out the tons and tons of information. And the other thing is we have some sort of set questions that folks are going to respond to. So we hope to have some good Q&A afterwards, but let's save some of the, jot your questions down. Feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try to keep track of those. So I'll go ahead and introduce briefly our panelists. So we have Dr. Owen Murray, who is the Vice President of Correctional Managed Care for UT Medical Branch. And Dr. Murray formerly was at Cook County, so he spent some time working in the jail there and has been at Texas for the last 11 years. Then we have Stanley Richards, who Bree had mentioned a little bit before, who's Executive Vice President of Fortune Society. And for those of you who don't know the Fortune Society, it's really a model reentry agency, and they provide a really ton of great services, holistic, one-stop model, one-stop shop for folks for reentry. And then there's Mary Price, who again, Bree mentioned a little bit, who's General Counsel for Families Against Mandatory Minimum Sentencing. She directs the FAMM litigation project and is really involved in advocating at the federal level for sentencing reform. Maurice, Chammah, who many of you are probably very familiar with at the Marshall Project. He's a staff writer there and working on a book about the rise and fall, hopefully final fall, the death penalty. So he also, I recently found out, is a Fulbright alum, so I shared that with him. We were talking about that a little bit before. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our panelists to prepare themselves for the questions I'm about to throw at them, which mostly are softballs. So we're going to, each panelist is going to have a specific question that's sort of tailored to them. And then we're going to have a couple of general questions that everybody can sort of feel free to all our panelists can feel free to respond to. And then after that, we're hoping to generate some discussion and get some questions from all of you all. So my first question is for Dr. Murray. And I'm asking this within the context of his expertise as a clinician. So as a clinician who provides care to incarcerated populations, what do you see as the biggest challenges and the biggest unknowns that you've seen with respect to providing adequate health care to incarcerated older adults? So your experience as a clinician treating folks, what do you see as the biggest challenges and the biggest unknowns?
Is he here yet? I'm not sure if he's here yet. I think he was running late, Nick.
I saw him earlier.
Oh, here he is. Yes, I see him.
So Dr. Murray, there you go. You are unmuted.
Am I unmuted?
You are good to go.
All right, there we go. Well, I appreciate the invite and the question. I've actually been with UTMB here in Texas for the last 25 years, so I've got a quarter century of hard time in here. But, the question's a good one. I mean, again, if you look at the growth of the elderly in prison, it is the one group of patients that continue to grow at a consistent rate, not just in Texas, but really across the country. And, I think one of the biggest challenges right now that all states are facing is that, we didn't build prisons, in the 90s for patients who are, and we use 55 and older, but we didn't really build prisons for older folks. We built them for younger folks. And so working prisons into a place where they can, accommodate the needs of the growing number of elderly patients. And as I said, whether it's neurocognitive changes, whether it's, their need for additional healthcare services, you know, as their ADLs begin to, you know, require more maintenance. You know, how do you have a system and how do you have facilities set up to deal with that kind of acuity? And I think it's challenging for lots of states to find, you know, those types of facilities and that type of bed space that really adequately deals with the needs of the elderly. You know, that being said, you know, how do we deliver care? As I said, you know, we're in a place where, you know, unfortunately funding prison health is never really at the top of a lot of legislative agendas. And so, you know, when they look at the rising prison healthcare costs, a lot of it falls back on, you know, the growing number of elderly in prison. And, you know, depending on what state you're in, I mean, some states being more progressive in terms of trying to find programs to get, you know, some of these older patients out to a different environment outside the correctional system. But if you're going to retain them, then how do you provide that care? And, you know, what type of technology you're going to invest in? As I said, moving patients across, whether it's the facility or across the state to get care can be challenging. And so I think looking at investments like telehealth and bringing healthcare, not only medical, but also mental health care to older patients just makes it easier for them to be compliant. It makes it easier for the providers to continue on and get the subspecialty care and services that they need. And so, so again, I think designing care tracks and care programs within the system that allows and facilitates the delivery of care in a way that's easier for the patients to accept. I think, you know, again, that's another challenge that we all face. And then, you know, ultimately it's really getting good data to your funding sources. I mean, whether it's the legislature, county jails, et cetera, you know, and I think being able to explain the needs for resources, whether that's to actually build additional bed space or to have the funds necessary to provide the care levels that these patients require. You know, I think being able to have data, and I think that's why, you know, this ongoing focus of looking at the elderly and their needs in prison is so essential, just because it really helps to document that this is not just a Texas issue, that this is a national concern and one that really can be looked at and I think solved and solutions created around having good data and bringing, as I said, some of those fiscal consequences of the choice to keep people in prison, you know, through their later years in life. So those would be kind of the big three that I would look at, you know, that obviously face Texas, but really face our country as a whole.
Thank you for that. And that sort of sets up the next question I had for Stanley Richards. And so for Stanley, so your work, given your lived experience and your work in the reentry space, what do you see as some of the most significant challenges? We heard Dr. Murray talk a little bit about some of the challenges providing care on the inside. So what do you see, or what have you seen in terms of the biggest challenges that older adults face during the reentry process? And then as a correlate to that, what do you wish healthcare professionals knew about that reentry experience for older adults that might help that reentry planning work a little bit better?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I am just so thrilled to be part of this conversation, this network. And I want to put an emphasis on a couple of things. One, as a nation, we have been going in the wrong direction when we look at older adults and incarceration. I think at the very beginning, Bree laid out the number of people who are older who we see going into jails and prisons. And we've seen that in New York City, and we've seen it in New York State. And so I want to just lay the groundwork, right? Because we have not only a pandemic on our hands to deal with, but we have a crisis, I think, of conscience when we look at our jails and prisons, and we look at, on a local level, let me start with New York, where we see the jail population coming down, but the population we see coming up is older adults, people 55 and older. So let me just frame out what it looks like in New York City, right? In New York City, between 2007 and 2016, we've seen the population of 55 and older increase by 46%. hold that for a second. Now let me shift to right now in up to 2019. In 2019, we had 9,000 in New York State prisons. We had 9,555 people in our New York State prisons, 50 years or older. Of that, 5,700 were 55 and older. While again, we started seeing the populations come down, the population we see remaining in our prisons and in our jails have been people, older folks. In New York City, as a percentage of all the people who have been going into New York City jails, in 2009, it was roughly 3.8% of all admissions were 55 or older. Let's fast forward that to 2019. We are at 8.5% of all admissions have been 55 and older. So as a nation, when you look at New York City, New York State, we have a crisis of conscience when we look at putting older adults in jail, in prison, particularly in jail, because jail is about adjudication of your case for the most part. Where you have not been found guilty, you are getting your case adjudicated, and the risk to the community is the factor that you're weighing about whether someone comes into New York City corrections. Here's another fact. When we look at New York City, the number of people over 55, as they have been increasing as a percentage of all of the admissions in New York City, what we've seen is an increase in the number of people who have been sentenced to state prison. So while we've seen older adults as a percentage increase coming into the jails, we've also seen an increase of older adults increasing that leave New York City jails and end up in state prison. And the percentage of those folks are about 8.9%. Of all discharges to state prisons have been people 55 years and older. So we have a real problem in our jails and in our prisons when it comes to older adults. And I would encourage everybody, this is what I am so thankful for being on this call, because I think the partnerships we can create between researchers and practitioners and advocates and social service providers, we can develop a partnership that can really inform the nation about how we ought to be treating older adults in jails and prisons, how we ought to be fighting to decarcerate so many older adults, that jails and prisons is not the way that we need to deal with some of our most vulnerable population. So in what we've seen in New York City between 2015 and 2018, as I said, it's a little over 8% of the total population. The mean age was 58. 92% of them male, as everybody knows when you look at the percentage of people who are coming into jail and prison. 54% Black, 27% Hispanic, 13% white, 19% homeless. And I want to put a pin in that because that's one of the issues we deal with when we talk about what is it that medical providers need to understand and how do they do their work with older adults in jails and prison. 19% were homeless. So let's shift now to some of the health conditions, because this is a big issue, because when we talk about older adults in jails and prisons, we are talking about some of the most vulnerable. When we say people who are incarcerated are the most vulnerable, when you look at the socioeconomic, the connections to community, the access to jobs and school and trainings, you compound that for people with who are older adults because of the medical conditions. So here in New York City, 63% of those 55 and older who came through New York City jails had at least one significant chronic disease. 42% had high blood pressure, 19% diabetes, 9% HIV or AIDS, 3.6% have ever had cancer or a history of cancer, has cancer or a history. 5.5% need a wheelchair or a cane to get around. And the mean number of daily medications were 7. So this is in addition to a population who is really struggling just in terms of where they come from. On top of that, we have these additional health-related challenges. So what is it that medical providers need to understand about older adults in prison, and what do we need to do as a society to make sure that we are either diverting older adults or we are helping older adults return? One is housing. It is a critical issue when it comes to older adults. Many older adults have very strained family relationships, if any family relationship, right? If they're children, they have children, their children are grown, they haven't had a connection with their children, family is either gone or they have not been in contact with their family. The ability to have employment history that allows them to have access to credit and resources to be able to have a place significantly diminished. So housing is a critical issue when you talk about older adults in jails. Socioeconomic stability, the ability to get a job. People on public assistance in New York City, they're not going to be able to afford a 1-bedroom or studio apartment when public assistance pays $214 for rent. You're not going to find that in New York. So where do they end up? They end up in the shelters, which means they become 2 things: victims of the shelter system, of younger people in the shelter system. They become victims of the system because they have chronic disease and health care that they are not consistently following up on and engage in medical care. And they have challenges by way of getting into the world of work, particularly as you look at the economic landscape and the skills gap between the jobs that we have and the skills that's needed to fulfill those jobs. They are at the end of every longest line when it comes to the economic. They have a high burden of disability and chronic disease and serious mental illness. All of these issues compound the work that doctors need to do on the inside. It compounds the work providers need to do on the outside. And I can tell you, at Fortune, we have been dealing with seeing older adults coming home, long-termers mostly, who've been in prison 20, 30, 40 years. We have somebody who lives in our residence right now who's been in prison 52 years. He has no family. We are his family. He has been in prison so long. When it was time for him to get released, he was afraid to be released because he didn't know what the world out here looked like. And so we had to send somebody to go pick him up. We had to tell him that we are now his family, and now he's residing in our academy. But where does he go from there? He's in our transitional housing program. Where does he go from here?
So
He's not going to be able to get a job. And he has significant mental illness and medical. And so those are real challenges that medical providers need to deal with. Those are real challenges we have to deal with. And part of what Fortune is doing, we are opening up in 2021, we're opening up a re-entry housing for seniors, people who are 60 and above, who have come home, who don't have family, who don't have resources. We're partnering with Bronx Pro, which is a developer. We're partnering with HPD. We're partnering with the state to make sure that we have funding to be able to provide independent, stable, safe housing. It's a drop in the bucket. It is 57 units of housing for the hundreds and thousands of people who will be coming home, who are older adults in need of housing. So those are, I just wanted to frame, those are all of the challenges we need to figure out how to work together to address. And I think the work that you all are doing with respect to research, the work that you all are doing with respect to medical care and helping this nation think through how to handle those issues is critically important.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, Stanley. And that actually a point you made a second ago is a great tie-in to our next panelist, Mary Price. And so, Mary, I wanted to get your perspective. You know, one of the examples that Stanley was just mentioning, somebody, you know, being incarcerated for such a lengthy amount of time and having this fear of getting out, and you on your end, you know, really working on the forefront of trying to reform sentencing practice in the United States. So how do you explain, you know, how do you see the sentencing practices that we've seen over the last, you know, decade, couple of decades, as contributing factors to the increases we're seeing in the population of older adults? And really, what sorts of research can us as public health and medical and other, you know, health researchers do to kind of help reverse this trend? So what are your thoughts around that?
Thanks. Those are terrific questions. And just a minute to say thank you for inviting me, for including me in this conversation. I'm really honored. Bree and I met 4.5 years ago, Bree, next to each other, giving testimony to the U.S. Sentencing Commission about the topic of compassionate release. And we may be able to tell the story later of how transformative that day was, because it transformed the world of compassionate release, at least for the federal system. We didn't know then what it would mean today, but in the advent of COVID, it has been quite something. So hopefully we can get to that. But thanks for the question. I think that the key factors for sort of leading to the situation we're in now were the advent of mandatory minimum prison sentencing and truth in sentencing laws back in the mid-1980s, principally. Those laws meant that more people would be serving prison terms, and not only would more people be serving terms, but those terms are much longer and cannot be easily shortened. So for example, in the federal system, the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 and the advent of mandatory minimums really transformed the system. The Sentencing Reform Act ended parole. It ushered in determinate sentencing. In other words, there wasn't a way to get out early, right? And it strictly limited the opportunity for courts to revisit a sentence once it had been imposed. Now, there were a few narrow exceptions to that, and again, compassionate release comes in again because compassionate release was one of them, but it was until very recently, very, very narrow exception. So the other thing that happened was that mandatory minimums began to sort of overwhelm the system at the same time. Legislators began passing these laws in some misguided attempt to address what they saw as rising violence associated with drug crime and so forth. And what happened is that legislators began to set prison terms and took the job of exercising judicial discretion at sentencing away from judges. And so judges' hands were literally tied. And we heard over and over again back in the day when judges had to begin to adjust to these sentences. I would rather not give the sentence that I have to impose, but I cannot do it because the law requires it of me. So they were trapped. We were all trapped in this sort of do the crime, do the time moment that has just, the legacy of that continues to this day. The federal system exploded and the states followed suit. The states adopted a number of these. Some of them were incentivized with funds to do so. Mr. Richards discussed the population of older adults in prisons in New York. State prison populations mirrored this. Across the country, they increased 55% between 1993 and 2013. The proportion of incarcerated people who were 55 years old and older increased 400% in that same period. They made up 11.3% of state and federal prison populations at the end of 2016. And while state prison populations are finally beginning to fall, the same cannot be said for older populations in prison. So by 2030, it's estimated that prisons will house more than 400,000 individuals who will be 55 years old and older, and that those individuals will make up nearly 1/3 of the populations of prisons. And I think that these laws were passed again, they were supposed to promote public safety, but they definitely failed to do so. The costs are staggering, and the human costs, they can't be quantified, really. Mr. Stanley provided us a very poignant example of the challenges that many of our older incarcerated individuals face on the outside. And I know our next panelist is going to be addressing the challenges on the inside. But I will tell you that the costs of of this incarceration are extreme, and that the rising state of cost of state prison healthcare is due largely to the growing population of our older incarcerated individuals who have disabilities and chronic medical conditions. So I expect that we'll talk more about costs later on, but in terms of sort of solutions, one of the things that I think we do know a lot about is that we have a fair amount of data about the cost of incarcerating older adults. I think we need better information chronicling the low recidivism rates of those older adults who return from prison to the community. We have some of that, we have pieces of that. There's some good information from Pennsylvania. There's a very good studies from the US Sentencing Commission, and the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General did a research study on the return of individuals by way of compassionate release. That's an older study, but the recidivism rate of those individuals was 3%, which compares enormously favorably against other numbers. So I think I would love to see more as an advocate, as a person who's working in this field, trying to convince lawmakers to change these laws, and trying especially to help lawmakers begin to think about taking a second look at the population of people who are left behind. We do lots of sentencing reform now, we do lots of different kinds of things, but frequently those reforms leave individuals to continue to serve sentences that would no longer be imposed today. So we want to be able to convince them that it's not only a just thing to do, it's a safe thing to do, to begin to take a really good look at what it would mean to release older individuals and how safe we will be if we do so. They are the most costly to incarcerate, but the least likely to recidivate, I think, as Bree pointed out earlier.
Thank you really for that insight and for the historical perspective, which is really crucial. And that brings us to Maurice, our fourth panelist. And to tie all this together, going back to Dr. Murray and, some of his comments about the challenges providing medical care, and then the healthcare challenges of the transitional period that Stanley talked about. And then of course it's compounded by the lengthy sentencing practices that Mary just mentioned. So Maurice, you've been doing a lot of reporting with the Marshall Project and elsewhere around the conditions of confinement. And can you give us some perspective in terms of, what is your perception about how older adults are treated in correctional settings, what obstacles they face in those settings, and might we use that to piggyback on what Mary was just saying as additional impetus for early release, compassionate release, some of those practices?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, first of all. And I mean, there's obviously this whole sort of interlinked stew of different problems that older incarcerated people face. The way that I'm often thinking about it as a journalist is, how can we make the public and by extension policymakers sort of pay more attention to this group, pay more attention to their problems, fix some of these issues. And so a lot of what I and my colleagues do is try to think creatively about how to cover these issues. We often find sort of two truths that kind of cut against each other. One is that older incarcerated people are often our best guides to the system, because they've often been incarcerated for so long that they're the ones that can explain the dynamics of a prison, the sort of trends they're seeing in terms of what they and their peers are facing in terms of access to medical care, and other kinds of problems in the system. At the same time, I've often felt like older incarcerated people that I speak with and exchange letters with suffer from a kind of hopelessness, where there's a feeling of like, well, I've been here forever, I'm sort of used to the problems in here, they don't seem novel to me, I don't have a role to play. So often I find myself trying to kind of convince people, your role is being the expert, and you're more of an expert than you realize. And I think the thing that kind of bridges all of these issues together that all these panelists have talked about is the difficulties when it comes to older incarcerated people sort of advocating for themselves, telling their own stories, and alerting us as the public and as sort of via journalists often as to what the challenges they face are and what kinds of sort of elements of the policy or ways of understanding the policy should be at the top of our agenda. At the Marshall Project, I mean, so, you know, one way in which the access problem plays out is simply having the access. There's a great Texas journalist named Dick Rivas who had a piece several years ago that I found to be a sort of very textured and granular look at what it's like to be an older, he interviewed a group of older men in the Texas prison system. And by interviewed, I mean, he exchanged letters with them over the course of a year. He asked TDCJ, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, if he could just go into the prison and hang out with these guys, see their cells, describe what their life is like, you know. And this would not have been uncommon in the 60s and 70s. Like, I can think of examples of journalism from earlier eras in which wardens allowed this. But commensurate with the rise in incarceration, we've also seen a kind of rise in a kind of security thinking that in which public relations officers for prison systems are just less interested in and less able to get clearance to let journalists in to actually see these conditions, talk to these men in their own environment. There's, you know, you can do your best via snail mail letters. Some prison systems have limited forms of email, but you're really hamstrung when you can't actually go in. So that adds a kind of barrier when it comes to these older incarcerated people telling us what it is we should be paying attention to and allowing the stories to kind of organically emerge. I mean, for the most part, when I come up with story ideas, it involves a lot of back and forth with sources. It's not like I just kind of come up with it one day. It's like these ongoing conversations. And so if you imagine trying to do that by letter, it's just much slower, it's much harder. I have some extremely sort of dedicated and intrepid colleagues who you know are corresponding with dozens of men in the Texas prison system. One of them is Carrie Blakinger, who ended up doing a investigative story on the lack of dentures and the fact that many incarcerated older men and women in Texas prisons were having to eat like mushy food, basically, because they didn't have teeth and they weren't being given dentures. And the kind of public awareness that came from that series that she wrote for the Houston Chronicle led ultimately to a sort of innovative program of printing 3D, using 3D printing to make dentures for some of these men so that they could eat solid food. So, and it's just an example, but, you know, Carrie wouldn't have found that story if she wasn't like constantly sending these letters back and forth to guys to hear about this problem and to put it at the top of her agenda. We also do this at the Marshall Project through a series called Life Inside that involves, so typically at the Marshall Project as journalists, we're writing articles based on interviews with people, based on getting public documents through FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests. But we also publish first-person pieces by incarcerated people, and I've been often thinking, you know, what is an element or an aspect of the experience of being older in a prison or a jail that might be new or novel to people, that might sort of pique their interest and lead them to click on it and read a little bit more about this experience. You know, what is the novel or surprising element that might sort of, through a headline, be the Trojan horse to get somebody deeply into someone's experience by reading an essay about their time in prison. And we're always trying to develop that so that people can hear directly, because there's a sort of power in hearing directly and not filtered through journalists, what kinds of issues these older incarcerated people are facing. And then sort of the last thought on that is that I think, you know, with an audience of researchers here, I want to sort of put a plug in for building relationships with journalists, because, you know, we, in criminal justice journalism, I think we've all developed as journalists relationships with lawyers where lawyers know that they can just call us and say, I'm working on this case. I think it's important that the public know about it. I think it's new or interesting. I think it's going to wake people up to X problem, and I think you should write about it. We get these calls all the time from lawyers. I get them much, much less often from doctors, from medical researchers. I think there's a culture of privacy, which is sort of important and to be offended. It's something that also exists for lawyers through attorney-client privilege. Doctors have HIPAA, but I still think that there are sort of creative ways that could be birthed from sort of more conversations between journalists and medical researchers and doctors who go into prisons and jails about what they're seeing. I've found Bree to be sort of incredibly helpful in this regard. 5 years ago, I was writing a short piece on this phenomenon of older incarcerated people having medical problems that were sort of more often associated with older people in the free world. So someone in their 50s in prison or jail having problems that one would associate with their 70s or 80s. And I was just trying to think creatively about like, well, how, I mean, I can write about this, I can sort of summarize and explain for a layperson what this research is showing, but how do we like make it real for people? And ultimately it led to Bree connecting me with one of her research assistants who described going into a jail and interviewing this man and her asking him about like his medical problems and him saying, where do I begin? And she just, Marielle was the name of, I believe, this researcher. And she just had this ability to sort of describe how this man described his problems. It didn't violate any HIPAA rules. And it was a way of sort of making the issues come alive. And this is what we're often looking for as journalists. So, but that only comes from these sort of ongoing conversations with researchers, with doctors, with people in the policy space like Stanley, to sort of help us come up with the ways that we're going to kind of, I mean, for lack of a better word, sort of sell this to the public as something that they should pay attention to and care about and pressure their elected officials to put at the top of their agendas.
Thank you. And I recognize that we're kind of running you all ragged, so we're going to do a break here in a minute, but I wanted to ask sort of, I know we have a bunch of questions that folks have posed, and we are happy to kind of facilitate asking those questions down the road, because unfortunately we won't get all the time that we want. But one question that I feel we sort of have to ask everybody, context of COVID. So we're all sort of in this unprecedented pandemic. We all hear and read all the time about and see, many of us, what's going on in correctional facilities. And so, you know, if you all could comment a little bit about, you know, how COVID has impacted your work, but really kind of framing it. And, you know, we've heard all of you touched upon this, this idea of, you know, we've got this population that really many of us collectively agree shouldn't be in prison. So we want to advocate for more release, expedited release. You know, we all know the data around the public safety implications. We talked about the costs. We've talked about sentencing, reentry, all of these things. So, but it's not happening. So what do we do? And as researchers, what can we do to help you all and to sort of support this? So it's kind of a multi-part question. Again, just kind of brief thoughts about that. COVID, we're all trying to get more folks released. They're not being released. It's we you know, have this culture of punishment in the United States. You're punished forever. And yeah, how do we as researchers, how do we work with that? How do we give you the data, the tools that you all need to effectively tell a different story and to push policymakers to say, yeah, it's not just a good idea. This is critical work that we've got to move now. No pressure to give us the answers here, but just, and I'm open, any of the four panelists who want to respond.
Yeah, let me start. So I think part of what we could do is there are models in the country where we have done it well, and it's going to sound strange, but I think in New York City, Mayor de Blasio, the district attorneys, service providers have really thought through how to manage COVID for older adults, vulnerable people in New York City jails. We went from our population roughly before COVID hit was around 6,000 people. We are now hovering around 3,900 people, because what the city did was this release program. First, targeting people with health conditions that COVID would significantly impact. And then we pushed them and they focused on older adults. And so we got the population from roughly around 6,000 down to 3,900, brought service providers together, provided housing through some of the hotels that were laying empty. So the city figured out a way how to provide economic relief to some of the hotels, provide housing for people who were being released and were vulnerable because of COVID, and we got it down. We also put together a coalition, we call ourselves, it came out of the CARE Act, dealing with older adults in jails and prison. And we felt like the governor didn't do enough, although he released like 175 people. There was still hundreds and hundreds of people who are in that age category, in that vulnerable category that he could have released. And I think the partnership that folks on this call could do is provide the data that advocates and service providers could use to be able to educate our policymakers around two issues. And someone spoke, Maurice, I think, spoke about it just a minute ago. One, the financial cost of keeping older people incarcerated. That dealing with those medical issues, dealing with the kind of challenges older adults face while they're in prison, that expense is being borne by the state. And it would be much more efficient and impactful if those things were dealt in the community. Second is giving models, evaluating various models that could demonstrate how we could safely release older adults from jail and prison into the community. Two ways we can do it.
Thank you, Stanley. I want to just give everyone else just like, so Mary, Maurice, Owen, just 1 minute. And so if you just concisely 1 minute, give us a solution.
I would say that as you're doing research, be thinking about, you might be dealing with hundreds or if not thousands of case studies or people when it comes to data, but you will inevitably be meeting lots of people who are struggling with COVID behind bars or aging behind bars. I would encourage you to think about who are the people whose individual stories stick with you and keep you up at night, and like are the ones you find yourselves, telling your friends about over a drink or something, and keep that in mind as a way of thinking about how do we tell the stories of these people. And feel free to come to me or the Marsh Project or journalists whenever, but saying like, this is the guy who's illuminates this larger data point that I'm trying to get people to understand, but he's the guy who, or she's the woman who is really kind of keeping me up at night because of their struggles. So just keep that at the top of your mind, the sort of personal storytelling angle.
Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
So since the beginning of the pandemic, 11,120 people have been infected with COVID-19 in the federal system. 117 people have died. It's racing through prisons right now. A compassionate release clearinghouse that my organization and others set up a year and a half ago. We kicked down the walls earlier this year, totally ramped up in order to recruit and train pro bono lawyers to take on the cases of individuals who have to get out of prison, right? And the reason we can do this is because the law changed in this area. That there was a mechanism in the federal system which used to be the worst compassionate release in the country became one of the very best. And what I want to do from this moment is to take the lessons that we're learning from systems that aren't letting people out and systems that are. And this federal system is not doing all that great a job, but since the beginning of the pandemic, 144 people were released by a compassionate release over the last year and a few months, starting in January of 2019. 1,132 of people have been released starting in the beginning of March. What I want to take from this, and what I hope that we learn as a reformative system, is that we can release people, we should release people. And then I want to take this as a lesson that we need as a criminal justice system and as a community of people who care about these people to promote second look, that we need to go back and look at every single person, not just people who are in danger of dying, but every single person whose sentence is too long, who's growing old in prison, who may die in prison because we can't get to them. So we as a system can't just go back and rescue people because they may get COVID. We've got to take from this what has this taught us about our system? And we need to move forward and begin to transform overall.
Thank you. Owen, last brief word.
Just real quick, I mean, I think what Mary just commented on, I mean, you know, COVID is in the moment, and to the extent that this is something that's going to follow us through, you know, for whatever years, I said that's still unknown. But I think, you know, the point about looking at alternatives for people growing old in prison, to me, is essential, because whether it's COVID or heart disease or dementia, you know, all of these are just issues that state has to pay for, the patients have to deal with, the treaters and the healthcare people have to take care of, the prisons have to build facilities for. As I said, it's just an enormous use of resources that could be used in so many other different ways. So as I said, COVID is in the moment, but to me, it's more about what Mary said in finding alternatives for getting, in a safe way, elderly folks out of prison.
Well, with that, I want to just thank virtual clap to all of our panelists. I wish we had about 3 hours here, because honestly, we could, that's not even enough time. So thank you all. This has been really fantastic.